What I thought I would do today, and particularly for the media, is to provide about 12 very simple historic reference points that begins to provide the factual platform of how Africans arrived, survived, and thrived in Providence and here in Rhode Island. And I'll certainly make copies available if you have an interest, because I want you to listen very carefully to these points, because it forms the very basis of the truth-telling and reconciliation and eventually reparations that the mayor's vision has brought before us. The transatlantic slave trade from Africa to the New World would have been the largest and longest maritime migration movement in the history of the world. The reason for this worldwide maritime movement was to obtain enslaved African labor to replace indigenous labor in the New World that would later go on and harvest the cash crops that would make European kingdoms, families, wealthy beyond imagination. As Rhode Island became the first American colony to declare its independence from Great Britain on May 4th, 1776, Rhode Island was also one of the most active slave ports in all of British North America, led by Newport, Bristol, and here in Providence. Between 1705 and 1805, that 100-year period that we call the Golden Age of American maritime economy, Rhode Island merchants and Rhode Island vessels from Providence, Newport, and Bristol would participate in over 900 documented slave voyages, meaning ships that left Rhode Island ports to sail to what is today West Africa along the Gold Coast and Guinea Coast and Windward Coast, and then via the Middle Passage to transport enslaved Africans to work as beasts of the fields in these sugar plantations and coffee plantations of the West Indies. And then eventually these same Rhode Island merchants would bring the byproducts, largely sugar and molasses, back to Rhode Island, but also would bring with them captured Africans. What stands out about African slavery, and I want people to really understand what I say here, what stands out about African slavery as compared to any time in the history of slavery in the world is the unique concept of confining slavery to a single race of Africans, and that the children of enslaved mothers are born into slavery for the remainder of their lives. So for anyone to say that slavery has been a part of world history, they're partially right. But the full story is, and the reason that we are here today, the enslavement of Africans was the one point in the history of the world where nearly every country, every explorer, every colonist, every settler, every person that was even persecuted for religious freedom that landed in Rhode Island, they all equally participated in enslaving over 10 million African men and women and children. That is unlike any time in world history, and that any child who was born to an enslaved mother was by law enslaved for life. That's not indentured servitude. That is African enslavement. But despite arriving enslaved, Africans would soon become a vital part of the earliest settlement of Providence, greatly influencing the city's economic, religious, and civic origins. Their creative survival, and this was something coined over 30 years ago by my mentor, Rowena Stewart, and the Rhode Island Black Heritage Society, it speaks directly to the resiliency of African heritage people then and today. We have an obligation to learn from our ancestors so we can make a better Providence, a better Rhode Island, a better world today and tomorrow. So let me just really briefly introduce you to some of the African heritage history and leaders of early Providence that we'll be building upon, working with our historical institutions and collaborations, and making available to the larger public, and hopefully, particularly to our K-12 public students. Let me begin by a very important point. Slavery is not Black history. Black history is how our African ancestors survived slavery, thrived from Jim Crow, and exist to this very day. That's Black history, and that's what we'll be learning today. In 1790, 475 African heritage people lived in Providence. 427 of them were free, 48 still enslaved. And the majority of them lived in 2 census tracts in the east side of Providence. African heritage men and women in early Providence would create institutions to serve their needs as free people of color. The very first institution they would establish in 1794, they would establish the Providence Free African Union Society, which was a mutual aid society that assisted them on education, jobs, burials, and most importantly, building an African identity. And what you'll find here in Providence, Newport, Philadelphia, Boston, New York, all the places where there were large, sizable, free African communities before the beginning of the 19th century, they saw themselves, they called themselves African. It is our African school, it's our African church, it's our African society, it is our African lodge. We are Africans in America. And we actually know the names of the African men who formed the African Society in Providence and who lived in what is today College Hill. Men like London Spear, William Stober, Bonner Brown, Cudge Brown, and Bristol Oney. We have their names and we have documents of their lives. We can bring back the very lives of our ancestors that survived the Middle Passage, survived enslavement, and began to build a vibrant African community right here in our capital city of Providence. The Free African Union Society would evolve into the African Union Meeting House and School, and by 1819, it would evolve into the first free black church in Rhode Island, Coggan Street Baptist Church. The building that stands today at the corner of Meeting and Coggan Street dates back to 1874, but the history of that congregation dates back to the earliest days of enslaved Africans winning freedom and organizing and building their place of worship. And that building sits in our capital city in the East Side as a testament of African resiliency and survival. One of Africans' earliest leaders in Providence was a man named Ichabod Northrop. His father fought for the 1st Rhode Island Black Regiment during the American Revolution, and Ichabod Northrop in Providence would set himself up. In fact, his home still stands on Cushing Street, 15. He would set himself up as an early leader of the church, and then he would also become one of the earliest, the most aggressive leaders to integrate public schools in Rhode Island. Rhode Island, in the North, the liberal North, the progressive North, still had segregated schools until well after the Civil War. It was Ichabod Northrop and other men and women of Providence and Newport and Bristol would come together and ensure that all public schools would be integrated here in Rhode Island, here in Providence, here comfortably in the North. And there are leaders like Alfred Niger and George Willis of Providence. They would represent Rhode Island in the very first American Society of Free Colored Convention in 1831 in Philadelphia. These men came together with over 100 African men from across the North at that time for a single reason. In the antebellum area, the time that we call the 1820s to the 1840s, there were a series of horrific race riots. We talk about Tulsa from 1920, but our Tulsa of 1920 is Hardscrabble and Snowtown in 1824 and 1831 here in Providence. Some of the most devastating race riots where African Americans, homes were burned, buildings were burned, and were displaced, not once but twice. And Alfred Niger came together to organize with other African men to begin to build resiliency and fight against this new challenge, post-slavery and now free, but now living in a society that was not equal and certainly separate. So today, we stand upon the Dexter Training Grounds given to the city of Providence by Ebenezer Knight Dexter. But how many know that the 14th Heavy Artillery Regiment, the first African heritage regiment formed in Rhode Island, and one of the first heavy artillery regiments formed in the United States, trained right here on these grounds? If you look around and you see beautiful grounds, but what's missing is a recognition of the men who fought, served, and died in the 14th Heavy Artillery Regiment. Thank goodness we've got Anastasia Williams here and Senator Harold Mitz. They get it, they lead it, and they're on top of these issues. And I'm proud to work with them as I'm proud to work with the mayor. So today, a challenge facing African heritage people in Providence and across America is not only avert racism, but its invisibility. Far too much of Rhode Island American history is taught, interpreted, and memorialized through the owner class viewpoint. That is the majority viewpoint. That is not the African, not the Latino, not the indigenous, not the people of color viewpoint. Confederate memorials and statues that celebrate those that secured fame through racial oppression is just not the history of America that the growing majority will tolerate any longer. Rather than only taking statues down and removing state names, we should also be advancing African heritage history in our public schools, reclaiming public spaces such as the Dexter Training Ground, and most importantly, building a series of investment policies to ensure that African heritage and indigenous people survive and thrive in America today and tomorrow. So Providence and Rhode Island can lead the nation on how we tell the inclusive history of all Americans through public memorials, public investments, and public education. But it's the truth-telling that begins today through the vision of our mayor in this executive order that will not only validate our earned African heritage and history in Providence and in Rhode Island in America, but most importantly, it will make clear that as Black Lives Matter, Black history matters. Thank you, Mayor. Thank you, the people of Providence. We've got a great task ahead. Thank you.